So we're Californians. This is cool. Yeah, you know, it's funny. The media portrays all Californians as kind of being crazy. And we moved here, and we just kind of fit right in. And I'm wondering if that's because maybe we're a little bit crazy, too. So, no, we've actually... A question for you, though. Melissa was hiking yesterday, and... There you are. Melissa was hiking yesterday, yeah. And this little guy followed her, and so she took a picture of it. And there are no coyotes where we're from. So question, we're new to this being California thing. Is this something to worry about? Like, if you've got a coyote stalking you in the, seriously, no? Leave them alone, they'll leave you alone? Or, I mean, he didn't have an Acme anvil or anything like that, or painting, on the side of the cliff, painting a railroad tunnel or anything like that. So I figured it was safe, but they're all right? As long as it's not a pack, staring you down, you're okay? All right, we're learning. So thanks for filling us in on how all this works. So Jesus told a parable called the Good Samaritan, and it might be his most famous parable. It's what we're going to be talking about today. You might have heard of this parable before, but as I was studying this story this week, there was some background to it that I discovered that really made it come alive for me, and hopefully it'll do the same for you. So, loved by the hated. Let's look at this story today. You might have heard of this group called the Jews, and you might have heard of this group called the Samaritans. A couple thousand years ago, they hated each other, just could not stand each other. You may not know why, though. So I'm going to give you a quick history lesson in pictures of why they hated each other so much. This says the divided kingdom. There was a time when the nation of Israel was divided, but there was a time before that when it was unified. Can anyone tell me who the kings were in that time when it was united? Anyone know? 3 kings, right? David was one. Before him was Saul. After him was Solomon, right? That was the Camelot years of Israel. After Solomon, who came next? Trick question, right? A lot of times, our eyes gloss over as we read all these lists of kings and stuff like that. It was actually a guy named Rehoboam. He was Solomon's son, and he decided to rule with an iron gauntlet. He had this iron fist, and his counselor was like, Rehoboam, just lay off a little bit, your dad was hard on the people, but if you just kind of come in and earn their respect. And he's like, no, I'm going to, and he tells the people, he says, my father scourged you with whips, I'm going to scourge you with scorpions. And he just kind of had this iron fist. And so the northern kingdom, the people living up here, there's 10 tribes up here, and they were like, what do we do? What do we have to do with you? Let's we reject you. And so they just kind of did their own thing. And 2 tribes stayed down here, and they eventually became known as Judah. And then this up here was Israel. And it was a divided kingdom at that point. And a few generations in, we have this king named Omri. He's the, I think, 7th king of Israel. And he buys this hill, and he calls it Samaria. I just speculate that this is how it worked. He had an assistant. He's like, hey, nice hill that you just bought. What are you going to call it? And he's like, boy, this is some area, isn't it? And his assistant's like, that's really good. Let's write it down. He's like, no, that's not what I'm really calling it. No, it's already carved in stone. So, all right, okay, we'll just go with it. So they call it Samaria. They call the hill Samaria. That becomes the city. The city is called Samaria. And then that became such a prominent city that the whole area eventually became known as Samaria. So, and Samaria became very idolatrous, just followed any and every god that from the surrounding nations and whatnot. And so the people in Judah looked up at the people in Israel, the northern kingdoms, and they were like, you guys are so idolatrous. And so there was kind of this, holier than thou, they kind of looked down at them, and then they were like, hey, you guys are, so uppity. And so there started to be this tension between the 2 groups. Go to a very important date in Israel's history, 722 BC, the Assyrians come in. So the Assyrians come in, they conquer the northern kingdoms, Israel, and they take a whole bunch of the Israelites out of Israel, and they take them and they send them to other nations. And then they take groups of people from other nations and bring them into Israel. And so Israel is kind of gouged and replaced with a whole bunch of people that worship other gods, and they're people from other nations. And these are the groups that God said, hey, don't intermarry with these groups because what they're going to do is they're going to cause your hearts to stray from me. And that's exactly what happened. So the Assyrians take a bunch of the Israelites, left some, but take a bunch of the Israelites, put them in other nations, and then replace them with these other people that follow other gods. And so then the Israelites that are there in Israel, they start mingling with and marrying and adopting the gods of these other nations, and then their hearts stray from the one true God. And it just became problematic. And so what eventually happened was their religion was very mixed. Their races were very mixed. In fact, their religion, they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament. 34 of the 39 books, they just threw them away. They were like, no. They kind of looked a little bit like Judaism, but it was their own thing. They just adopted the Torah and left everything else out. And they kind of did some of the practices, but not all of them. And so it was a very mixed religion. And the people in Judah who were hanging on to Judaism, they're like, what are you guys doing? That's not even pure religion. You're not even following the one true God. You're following all the gods of the nations around you. They were mudbloods, to use a J.K. Rowling term, if anyone gets the reference. So that's exactly what the northern kingdoms became, mudbloods. They were mixed everything, mixed race, mixed religion. Everything was just kind of this hodgepodge, right? And then, 586 BC, the Babylonians come in, and they conquer the southern kingdom, and they gouge the southern kingdom, and they take all the leaders of the southern kingdom, tens of thousands of the leaders of the southern kingdom. One of them was actually Daniel, the prophet Daniel. He was a young kid. He was like a sophomore in high school when this happened, and he gets taken with tens of thousands of the leaders, the elite class of the southern kingdom. They go off to Babylon, and then there's this gap, there's this void in the southern kingdom. And few decades later, we got this king named Cyrus in Babylon, and he's like, you guys have a temple back there in Jerusalem? And they're like, yeah. They're like, why don't I help you guys build it? And they're like, yes, like the Lord's coming through. And so he sends some of the leaders back to the Jerusalem, and he says, why don't you build your temple? I'll fund it. I'll help you guys out. And so we read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they go back and they start building. The Samaritans catch wind of this, and they're like, hey, why don't we help you? And the people from Judah are like, no, we got this. Like, you guys are sellouts. You guys kind of have this compromised faith. We're good. We don't need you. And then we read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that the people of Samaria, they were like, they were offended by that. And so they took bribe money to actually start insulting and mocking the people that were building the temple. And they're like, you guys are never going to do it. Foxes are going to walk on the walls, and they're going to knock them down. And so they were just frustrating the plans of the people that were building the temple. Okay? So once again, this frustration, this tension between the two groups actually becomes deeper at this point. And the Samaritans taking bribe money to frustrate the plans of the Jews, it just bothered the Jews so much. And so their frustration plans didn't work, and so eventually the Samaritans were like, well, if we can't join in on your temple, we're just going to make our own. So they go up to a place called Gerizim. There's a mountain called Gerizim, and they're like, we're going to build our own temple here. The Jews are like, you guys do that. And so they build this temple, and that was kind of their center of worship, even though it was kind of this counterfeit temple, according to the Jews. That was their thing. And so fast forward to the time of Jesus, he meets a woman at a well, and what does she say? What's she thinking about? She's like, should I be worshiping in Jerusalem or in Mount Gerizim? Because I'm a Samaritan. And right? That's kind of what she's going through, and Jesus is like, you don't get it. God is spirit, and they that worship him must do what? Worship him in spirit and in truth. It doesn't matter where you want to worship God, just worship God, okay? So that's kind of what's going on. At this point, the rivalry becomes deeper, and these guys kind of mock these guys. These guys think that the Samaritans are sellouts, and then more invasions start happening. Alexander the Great destroys everything in the known world, right? He gets to Jerusalem. He's going to destroy Jerusalem. This is true in history. He comes to Jerusalem and is ready to destroy them. The priests in the temple, they come out and they say, whoa, hey, time out. They said, you're not going to believe this, but some of our prophets prophesied that you would conquer the world. And he's like, what? They're like, I know, crazy, right? And so he's like, I like you guys. They're like, thank you. And they point out in the book of Daniel, and it's true, the book of Daniel prophesies that Alexander the Great pretty much conquered the known world. And so he's like, this is awesome. I like you guys. They're like, thank you. And so they have this, amiable relationship between Alexander the Great and the Jews. Meanwhile, the Samaritans hear about this, and they're like, we're Jews too. Like, we're related. We've got this common ancestry. If you like them, then you like us too, because we're just like them. And the Jews are like, not really. You guys are sellouts. but Alexander the Great, once again, destroying everything in his path, but he let them go. Then, fast forward another century, we have the Ptolemies of Egypt. They like the Jews as well. And what did the Samaritans say? Yeah, we're Jews. If you like them, then you like us too. Common ancestry, same religion, same thing. If you like them, you like us. And the Jews are like, no, you guys hate us. And what are you guys doing? You guys are just bending to every political wind, whichever way it blows, right? Fast forward another century. What happens? The Syrians come. The Seleucids come. These are the guys with the elephants. They come along, and they're destroying everything in their path. And they want to eradicate the Jews. They hated the Jews, and there was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he just hated the Jews so much that he conquers that area. And to insult, the highest insult that he could do to the Jews is he dedicated the Jewish temple in Jerusalem to Zeus and then sacrificed a pig on the altar. As offensive as it comes. The Jews hated the Seleucids, the Syrians, and Antiochus Epiphanes and all this. What did the Samaritans do? They're like, you hate those Jews? We do too. That's exactly what they did. And they said, if you want us to join you, we'll join you. The Seleucids are like, yeah, okay, let's do it. And so the Samaritans said, all right, we now dedicate our temple to Zeus. And the Seleucids were like, isn't your temple like Jewish? And they're like, no, not at all. It was just something that our ancestors did to kind of in a superstitious effort to get rid of this plague of lions. And it worked, but, we're now dedicating it to Zeus, and we're going to side with you. You want us to kill some Jews? We will do it. So talk about hatred deepening between these two groups. Just couldn't stand each other at this point. They were hired by the Seleucids to kill the Jews, and the hatred just was so deep at this point, so deep that fast forward another century, you have a guy named John Hyrcanus. He comes along, and he's like, I'm just going to destroy all of our enemies. Like, this is ridiculous. And so he starts fighting against the Seleucids. He also goes up and he destroys Samaria as well, destroys their temple, destroys their city. And he left it in ruins. And even to this day, the Samaritans have never rebuilt their temple. There are still Samaritans that meet on Mount Gerizim once a year for Passover and whatnot. It's a form of Judaism, but it's not really. Like, there's elements of it, but it's once again, it's very mixed with a lot of the religions from the area. And once again, the Jews, as you read Scripture, you'll find this out, that the Jews are very proud of their lineage, that it was pure and it wasn't tainted by interrelations with the other nations nearby that would cause their religion to be mudblood religion. So you see it, right? Can you kind of see why there was this hatred between the two groups? In fact, if you lived in Judea and you needed to get to Galilee, what would you do? Very easy to just go through Samaria, but what would you do? You would go around, and it would take a few extra days, but you would do it because you hated the Samaritans so much. And Jesus actually said, if you read the King James Version, I must needs go through Samaria. There was a point where he was like, I've got to do this. I have to leave a gospel presence in Samaria. And so he goes through through Samaria. But people at the time, man, they were like, okay, because remember the Jews had all their kosher laws and what foods are going to make you impure? Well, if the foods make us impure, then what? Think about the people. What about the people? Almost every time in the New Testament where there's a conversation of what's clean and unclean, it always leads to people. And they're like, yeah, but these people are unclean too, and so we need to avoid them. We need to make sure that we don't touch them. They're just going to make us ceremonially impure. So the Jews said, Samaritans, you guys have a mixed race, a mixed religion. You always bend with the political winds. You guys are sellouts. And whenever someone broke the law in Judea, by one of the rules that would cause you to deserve death, what would you do? You would just run up to Samaria to their counterfeit temple. They're like, they don't have any standards up there, so I'm just going to go, find haven up there. Samaritans would say, you Jews destroyed our temple, and you guys are so self-righteous and holier than thou. And so there was this hatred between the two. The Jews didn't touch the Samaritans. Samaritans stayed away from the Jews. Don't go near them. Feel the tension, right? And that's the backdrop for our text today. Let's read it. Luke 10 says this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. It's kind of like the guy's like, so what do I need to do to be saved? And Jesus is like, what do you think? He's like, I need to be perfect. And he's like, okay, go be perfect. It's kind of like that. And so it begs the next question, well, I'm not perfect, right? And so that's what the guy's saying here. It says, but he wanted to justify himself in verse 29. So he asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? Right? He wants to get off the hook, hoping to prove that not all people are his neighbors, especially the kind that he didn't like. So, back in Judaism, loving your neighbor, it only applied to your own bloodline. It never applied to the Gentiles or to the Samaritans. So in reply, verse 30, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. If you saw on the map, Jericho is actually north of Jerusalem. So why does it say down from Jerusalem to Jericho? Any thoughts? Right. Elevation. Jerusalem is like 3,300 feet higher than Jericho. So it's only six miles as the crow flies from Jericho to Jerusalem. But if you're making that hike down from Jerusalem to Jericho, it's more like a 17 to 20 mile journey. So, and lots of zigzags, as you'll see here, lots of zigzags on the path. And so the guy on the road gets beat up by robbers, and you can see if there's a lot of zigzags and turns, it'd be very easy for some thieves to hide around a bend and then just beat you up when you turn the corner, right? So that's why it was called the Bloody Way. This path was called the Bloody Way. Lots of turns where thieves could hide. A lot of people got beat up on this path. Someone mentioned to me this week, they said, I think this is what the psalmist is referring to when it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. The valley of the shadow of death. It may be referring to the Bloody Way, this path between Jerusalem and Jericho. So verse, whatever's next. They stripped him of all his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side as well. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, he couldn't even say Samaritan, could he? He says, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So there we have it. It's a great ethical teaching, isn't it? Ethic number 1, love your enemies, right? It's a very scriptural concept. Love your enemies. But if you're at all like me, sometimes that's easier said than done. Sometimes I just have a hard time loving certain people. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But sometimes it's a group of people that we're having a hard time loving. Sometimes it's a coworker. Sometimes it might even be a family member. Sometimes it's people who vote a certain way. Sometimes it's people who think a certain way. All right? The bottom line is that there are people in our lives who sometimes are just hard to love. Can you identify with that at all? Or am I the only one? Abraham Lincoln, a man who was not lacking for enemies, gave us some really good advice on how to lose your enemies. He said, don't I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends? So that's actually your first fill-in. Don't you destroy your enemies when you make them your friends? Jesus said, go and do likewise, right? So it's got to be possible. But how do we do that? Well, understanding where they're coming from is actually a really huge part of it. I have 2 quotes on that topic, and I wasn't sure which one to use. So the first one is this: if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each enough sorrow and suffering to disarm all of our hostility. That's John Corson. He's a Christian commentator. The other quote was, before you judge a man, walk a mile in his shoes. After that, who cares? He's a mile away and you've got his shoes. That's Scottish comedian Bill Connolly. It's just 2 guys saying the exact same thing, right? So, understanding where someone is coming from is huge. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with what they've done. It doesn't mean that what they're doing isn't evil. And how do you define evil? It's when someone does something to someone else that they wouldn't want done to them. That is evil, okay? It's not excusing their behavior, but understanding where they're coming from is a huge step to turning enemies into friends. I have a friend, and he was at a missions convention, and it was a Monday night down in Arizona, and he was at his church, and he was praying, and they were talking about missions, and all of a sudden, God just burdened him, just, you know, when God, like the Holy Spirit's all over you and just burdening you about something. And he's like, God, what is going on with me? He just had this burden for the people of Afghanistan. He's like, man, they need Jesus. And he just had this burden, strong conviction from the Holy Spirit. They need Jesus. And what can I do? And that was Monday night, September 10th, 2001. And the next morning was 9/11, and history was never the same. As we all watched the buildings fall in horror, he wept because it all made sense to him then. And he was like, God put a burden on my heart for Afghanistan because the Taliban need Jesus. Talk about learning to love your enemies, right? So he became a missionary to the Taliban, and he had a degree in agriculture, and so he brought his wife and his daughters to live in and among the Taliban, and he taught the Taliban how to farm more effectively and how to start fish farms, and I would say more things that have to do with agriculture, but I think that would show my ignorance on agriculture, so I'm just going to leave it at that. He taught them how to do what they didn't know how to do very well. So they really valued him. And you're like, how do you share the gospel with the Taliban? I asked him that, and he goes, you know what I do, Dave? He says, I just tell them stories. He says, I take all the stories from Scripture, and I just change the names. He says, and I'll tell them stories, and I'll say, once there was a king, and the king had a son. And he says, I'll tell them straight gospel. They just don't know it's Jesus yet. They know the stories, and they're learning the stories, and they love them. In fact, he said, I'll be having tea with them, and they'll say, we know you're a Christian, and if you ever try to convert any of us, we will kill you. You know that, right? he said they make it very clear. Like, we know you're a Christian. If you ever convert one of us, we will kill you. But keep telling us your stories. They said it was like water to their souls. They loved hearing those stories. They were getting the gospel. Talk about loving your enemies. What's another ethic? Be others-centered. That's another thing we get from this text, right? I want to think about the priest for a second. We're easy to kind of dismiss him as kind of being rude and mean and all that. And he was selfish for sure. But imagine this guy. When you were a priest and you did your duties at the temple, it usually took 2 weeks. You're up at the temple for 2 weeks, and then he's coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho, the scripture says. And so his temple duties are over. He's coming down, and he sees this guy that's all beat up. He doesn't know if this guy's a Samaritan or a Jew or a Greek. Like, he doesn't know. Is this guy a Gentile? Right? Usually you can tell by people's clothes where they're from, but this guy was stripped naked, so he doesn't know. And they all kind of have olive skin. Like, there's a commonality amongst their look in the Middle Eastern part of the world. And so he's looking, is this guy Greek? Is he Egyptian? Is he Phoenician? Is he Samaritan? Is he Gentile? Is he Jew? I don't know. But the thought was back then, if you touched a Samaritan, you were ceremonially unclean. So he didn't, why risk it, right? If you touched a dead body, once again, he doesn't know if this guy's going to die while he's helping him. If you touched a dead body, you had to return to the temple for another 7 days. The priests received a living from the tithes and the offerings from the people. But if you're ceremonially unclean, you don't receive those tithes and offering. Neither do your kids, neither does your wife, neither do any of your servants. So now he's got that to think about, right? He's like, I've been away from them for 2 weeks, and add another week to that, and they're not getting any help or any money during this time. You also couldn't distribute food or money to the poor during this season while you were ceremonially unclean. And so it's stuff to think about, right? If he touches a man and the man dies later, the culture was he was supposed to rend his clothes. He was supposed to tear his clothes. But the priests were like the elite status. They were the rich, they were kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The prestigious class in that society. They had the nicest clothes, and there were laws against destroying valuable property. And he's like, I'm wearing all these Tommy Bahama shirts, and I'm supposed to tear my clothes if this guy dies eventually. That's a lot to think about, right? Like, you got these really nice clothes and I'm supposed to tear them? I don't know. Stuff to think about. I just don't know if it's worth it. And then, to top it off, if the priest is defiled and he tries to serve on the altar in a state of being unclean, what would happen? This is a quote from the Mishnah. It says, young men among the priests took him outside the temple court and split his brain with clubs. They took it very seriously if you were in a state of being unclean and you tried to serve in the temple. So here's this guy. He's got all these things. Okay, what about my family? What about having to go back to the temple? What about what if he dies? What if he doesn't die, but if he dies later? What if he's a Samaritan? Like, all these things to think about. You can see his dilemma. And according to the Pharisaic laws, he was not obligated to help anybody who was a foreigner, only the Jews. If you want to fill this in, the two men asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? One man asked, if I don't help this man, what will happen to him? The priest's main concern is, what's in this for me? What do I get out of this deal? You guys, whether you have enemies or not, that is a really easy disposition to fall into, isn't it? Can't I just take the path of least resistance? I'll just do it next time. I don't want to make my family go without. I don't want to not be able to serve food to the poor. I'm already this far down the road. I just don't have the time. What's the common denominator word in all of those sentences? right? The priest said, I don't think there's anything in this for me. So he rode his horse to the other side. And then there's the Levite. The Levite comes along. He's an assistant to the priest. He's kind of what you would consider a social worker in today's day and age. You know, usually they go into it with big hearts and willing to serve. But this guy, he's also thinking about himself. He's very likely an assistant to the priest who's going before him and passes this guy on the other side. He's not as rich. He's not part of that elite class. He might want to serve, but his boss just passed around the other side of the road, getting around this Samaritan. What's he going to do? Archaeologists tell us that there are no inns on that path, the bloody way. He would have had to take the guy down to Jericho. And if you're doing that, there's a lot of priests and Levites that lived in Jericho. Everyone knew everyone. And so the priest passes, and then the Levite shows up with the guy that the priest passed. Talk about upstaging your boss. That is not wise if you want to get the promotion, right? And so it's really easy for him. He'd be like, well, I'm not going to do that. If he passed by him, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to show him up. No, thank you. Not going to upstage my boss. So he goes around on his donkey or horse to the other side of the road as well. So this guy is also just thinking about himself. Self-absorbed. The only thing he's thinking about is how it affects him. Once again, it's all about him. If you want to fill in the next one, there are two kinds of people in the world: those who enter a room and say, "Here I am," and those that say, "Ah, there you are." May we be "Ah, there you are" type people, right? Neither the priest nor the Levite were "Ah, there you are" type people. It was all about them and how inconvenient caring for this guy would be. But there's a third character in the story, and that's the Good Samaritan. What's his story? This guy's a Samaritan. Once again, not only do the Jews hate the Samaritans, but the Samaritans hate the Jews. It goes both ways. But once again, he's not thinking, what's in this for me? He's thinking about, what's the most loving thing for this guy who got beat up? And that is a really important question to ask. What's the most loving thing for him? Sometimes the most loving thing is giving the guy money, right? Sometimes the most loving thing is buying somebody a meal. Sometimes the most loving thing is giving someone a job. Sometimes it's spending time with them. Sometimes it's showing them tough love. What's the answer? Well, that's why it's a relationship with God, because he leads us and we're led by the Spirit. Simple answer is just be led by the Spirit. Whatever God speaks to your heart, he'll give you insight into knowing what's the right thing to do, the most loving thing to do in every situation. That's why we need to have listening hearts. Once again, remember, there's no inn between Jerusalem and Jericho, so more than likely, the inn is in Jericho. Now, picture this. This is Dodge City, Kansas, 1874. That's an actual picture from 1874. Go back a couple of decades to this little wicked city of Dodge City. Dodge City, 1850. Imagine a Native American from the Sioux tribe finds a cowboy with a couple of arrows in his back. He dresses the wounds, he helps him out, takes the arrows out, bandages him up, puts him on his horse, brings him to Dodge City, and is like, here you go. I helped him out a little bit. Can I get a room? How is that going to play out? Imagine, remember what you know about Dodge City, 1850. How is that going to play out? He's not getting out of there alive, you guys. I don't know if you know much about American history, but even if the Sioux Indian is helping this guy out, he is not making it out of there alive. Very much the same way with the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans bringing a half-dead Jew to an inn in an all-Jewish city. How's that going to play out? He knows he can't stick around very long, so what does he do? He gives the innkeeper some down payment money. But he also knows that if this guy doesn't get better and it takes a long time for him to recover, he's going to incur this huge debt. What then? Debtor's prison. That's what they did for people back then who couldn't pay their debts. So what does he say? He says, I'll be back, and whatever's owed, put it on my tab. I'll pay it when I get back. So this Samaritan is risking everything to help this guy. He's risking his life. He's risking his wealth. He's risking his reputation. So I have a question for you. Can you think of anyone else who sacrifices like this? That brings us to the good news. Jesus was the Good Samaritan for us, enabling us to be a Good Samaritan for somebody else. He just didn't care what it cost him to pay our debt. He bridged heaven and earth to sacrifice for us. He bandaged our wounds, and he was willing to face death to give us life. And even when we hated him, he loved us. We were like the guy beat up in the story, and the Samaritan comes along and bandages us up, puts us on his horse, and brings us to safety, and we're cursing him the whole time. You dirty, mudblood Samaritan, right? That's the way all of us were with God before we got it. Jesus had a betrayer in his group of disciples, and that betrayer's name was Judas. Knowing all along that Judas was going to betray him, he invited him to the table anyways. And that's what Jesus does for us, right? When you learn to sit at the table with your Judas, you'll understand the love of Christ. That's the last fill-in. So Jesus had this ability to love people who were his enemies. And if all he did was say, hey, I did it, you can do it too. I love my enemies and not be selfish, you can too. If that's all he did, we'd say like Rex says in Toy Story, he's like, great, now I have guilt, right? Like that's the way we'd respond to Jesus. We'd be like, great, thanks, Jesus. That's all I needed was a little bit more guilt, a little bit more, hey, you're not doing enough, right? That's the last thing we need. But what if I told you that Jesus lived the life that we could never live, but then he left his Spirit to dwell in us, and that Spirit enables us to live a little bit more like him? There's good news in that, right? That's where this message goes from good advice to good news. Once Jesus starts to live in us, our desires change. Our ability to love our enemies changes, becomes a little bit more of a reality. Our ability to think in terms of what's in it for them, it changes to what's in it. It changes from what's in it for me to what's in it for them. It all becomes a little bit more possible. Jim Cymbala preaches at a church in the slums of New York, and he tells us this story. It was Easter Sunday, and I was so tired at the end of the day that I just went to the edge of the platform, pulled down my tie, and sat down and draped my feet over the edge. It was a wonderful service with many people coming forward. The counselors were talking with these people. As I was sitting there, I looked up the middle aisle, and there in about the third row was a man who looked about 50, disheveled and filthy. He looked up at me rather sheepishly as if to say, could I talk to you? We have homeless people coming in all the time asking for money or whatever. So as I sat there, I said to myself, though I am ashamed of it, what a way to end a Sunday. I've had such a good time preaching and ministering, and here's a fellow probably wanting some money for more wine. He walked up, and when he got within about 5 feet of me, I smelled a horrible smell like I've never smelled in my life. It was so awful that when he got close, I would inhale by looking away, and then I'd talk to him and then look away to inhale because I just couldn't inhale facing him. I asked him, what's your name? David. How long have you been on the street? 6 years. How old are you? 32. He looked 50. Hair matted, front teeth missing, wino, eyes slightly gazed. Where did you sleep last night, David? Abandoned truck. I keep in my back pocket a money clip that also holds some credit cards. I fumbled to pick one out, thinking, I'll give him some money. I won't even get a volunteer. They're all busy talking with others. Usually we don't give money to people. We take them to get something to eat. I took the money out. David pushed his finger out in front of me. He said, I don't want your money. I want this Jesus, the one that you were talking about, because I'm not going to make it. I'm going to die on the street. I completely forgot about David, and I started to weep for myself. I was going to give a couple of dollars to someone God had sent to me. See how easy it is? I could make the excuse I was tired. There is no excuse. I was not going to see him the way God sees him. I was not feeling what God feels. But oh, did that change. David just stood there. He didn't know what was happening. I pleaded with God, God, forgive me. Forgive me. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry to represent you this way. I'm so sorry. Here I am with my message and my points, and you send somebody, and I'm not ready for it. Oh, God. Something came over me. Something I started to weep deeper, and David began to weep. He fell against my chest as I was sitting there. He fell against my white shirt and tie, and I put my arms around him, and there we wept on each other. The smell of his person became a beautiful aroma. Here's what I thought the Lord made real to me. If you don't love this smell, I can't use you, because this is why I called you where you are. This is what you are about. You are about this smell. Christ changed David's life. He started memorizing portions of Scripture that were incredible, and we got him a place to live. We hired him in the church to do some maintenance, and we got his teeth fixed. He was a handsome man when he came out of the hospital. They detoxed him in 6 days. He spent that Thanksgiving at my house. He also spent Christmas at my house. When we were exchanging presents, he pulled out a little thing, and he said, "This is for you." It was a little white hanky. It was the only thing that he could afford. A year later, David got up and talked about his conversion to Christ, and the minute he took the mic and began to speak, I said, "This man's a preacher." This past Easter, we ordained David, and he's an associate minister of a church over in New Jersey. And I was so close to saying, "Here, take this. I'm a busy preacher." We can get so full of ourselves. And then his closing prayer is going to be our closing prayer today. He said, "Lord, thank you for sending others our way. May we never stop seeing them as your precious children, no matter how busy or tired we become." Amen. I'm going to invite you to stand as we sing this song. As the worship team comes up, I want to ask you guys this. As we're singing this closing song, can I just let this be our altar call, so to speak? As we're singing, if you feel like there's someone, maybe it's a group of people, maybe it's a people that think a certain way, act a certain way, and you're just having a hard time loving them. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a coworker. If God brings someone to your mind who's like, "Hey, you've been having a hard time loving these people, and I want you to surrender that to me," here's what I want you to do. As we're singing this song, just lift your hands like this. And that's a sign of saying, "God, fill me with the love that I need." And he will answer that prayer 100% of the time, all right?